Taking the 1960 U.S. Census, Enumerator Forms and Materials. This is another JDW Talks. My targeted audience for this one are census researchers, future users of the 1960 census in 2032, that's when it's going to become public, and users of 1960 census data. This was recorded in August of 2020. Well, why am I doing this in 2020 when it won't be scheduled to become public until April of 2032? Well, here's a couple of reasons. I've got a lot of satisfaction out of these videos, these narrated PowerPoint videos. Some of the census material that I've been giving you will not be found on any other place on the internet, and I have the resources now to do it. As you can see, here's an Enumerator Kit from 1960. I'll be 90 years old when this becomes public, so I better do it now. In addition, this census will be a culture shock to genealogists, and I'll show you why. I'm going to look at 1940, 1950, and 1960 census forms. So here's the 1940 census form. Both sides are about the same. This is the B side. The other side is the A side. That's what it looks like. I'm holding it up with a clipboard. And it turns out that sampling started on this census, so that if your name appeared on one of two lines, you were asked additional questions on the bottom. So here's sampling. The unit is the individual, and the sample questions are on the same sheet. There was also a separate housing schedule on the 1940 census, and we never got a chance to see that. That was probably destroyed. And the only thing that people have seen is the population census. So let's turn to 1950. Here is the 1950 population schedule I'm holding up. And this is the population side. I'll show you what the other side looks like. If your name now fell on one of 6 lines, you were asked additional questions on the bottom. There's that area on the bottom. So sampling was increasing in terms of the number of questions. The back of the form, the back of this form, was the housing schedule, which again we didn't see. We did see a summary of in large cities with housing pamphlets of some of the statistics from this housing schedule. Let's look at the 1960 schedule. Sure doesn't look like a census schedule. And this one is the non-sample form, the population non-sample form. There are some housing questions on the bottom, so we'll be able to see that. And a separate form for the long form, the sampling form, which has questions on population and questions on housing. That sure doesn't look like a typical census form. And that's what I'm going to show you and teach you about in this talk. Here is a topic outline of what I intend to accomplish during this talk. We'll look at the basics. We'll look at some facts about the 1960 census. We'll look at those short and long forms. We'll find out what FOSDIC means. And then we'll look at enumerator training, available references, and then I will show you that I've made some scans of documents that you can pick up if you want to. So let's look at the basics for the 18th federal census in 1960. And this is for those of you who are just starting research, or even for the old pros. And I even revised it for this 1960 talk. The federal census is mandated by the U.S. Constitution, and it's been taken every 10 years since 1790. The questions may differ between the years, and they usually emphasize events of the time, important events of the time. There is a 72-year privacy period, that has nothing to do with life expectancy, so the 1960 census should become public on Thursday, April 1st of 2032. And I have a full YouTube video on the 72-year rule. If you want to know more about it, you can take a look at that video. So let's look at some census definitions. We use the Norman Rockwell cover from 1940. A census is a count. That's what people do. They count things. They count birds. They count people. The person doing the count is the enumerator, and the area that an enumerator covers is an enumeration district. That is the smallest unit of the census and is the one you need to know about if you're trying to look up people on the census. The enumeration is taking the count. And what we're especially interested in is the schedules, the things that the enumerator is writing on that has the information about the family or the group that's in front of him or her. So these are important definitions. Why a census? Why the federal census? Well, one of the main purposes was to reapportion the House of Representatives. Since 1913, they decided they couldn't just keep adding seats, so they set the number of seats at 435. And actually, that's not quite correct, I found out, because what happened in 1959 were that 2 states were added to the United States, and that was Alaska and Hawaii. And so what they did was they gave each of them a representative, so that the number temporarily went up to 437 seats. But after the 1960 census, Hawaii were given 2 seats and Alaska 1 seat in the House of Representatives. But there's a number of other reasons why we do a census. And it's interesting that the 1960 reference book has a whole bunch of different reasons, such as reapportionment by the states of membership in their legislative bodies. States used to have their own censuses. I don't know of any state that still does. So they use the federal government's census to reapportion their legislative bodies. Planning for schools and community needs, and where you want to locate a factory, where is the workforce, stores, offices. Developing urban renewal and housing programs. And remember, this is 1960. These were the ideas that they presented there. Estimating manpower available for industry and defense, analyzing economic and social effects of population growth, and planning marketing and advertising programs. What's interesting is that one reason was not shown on this reference manual, and that is that today the census is used in many federal programs to distribute money to states and to localities. And this 2017 paper found that 132 federal programs used Census Bureau data to distribute more than $675 billion in funds during the 2015 fiscal year. So let's go and look at some 1960 big count facts. Some of these are what I found interesting about this census. The population from 1950 to 1960 grew by a whopping 18.5%. The baby boom was living up to its name. And they also counted the U.S. territories like Puerto Rico, American Samoa, etc. The Census Bureau put in place counting protocols in the census, covering when no one was home or no one answered the census. They were concerned about the undercount. And the Bureau also increased their quality control of enumerators with field reviews, and I'll show you that later. It reduced the undercount by about a quarter to about maybe something like 3%. We'll talk about that later. This was the first census to provide data in electronic form to the public with privacy laws. The names and specific addresses of people were removed. So the 1960 census provided a wealth of information for sociologists and other people interested in such data. Now, for the next couple of slides, I'm going to go over a table from Glick in 1959 that compares the 1950 census items with the 1960 census items on the population schedule. And some of these are completely different. They weren't done in 1950, and some of them are of interest to me. So here we have age at last birthday, and in 1960, they at least wanted to know what month of the year you were born within a quarter. In other words, January, February, March, you would answer that quarter. They also wanted to know the state or country of birth, and it was kind of unusual the way they did this in both 1950 and 1960. So I want to show you that before I come back to this table. So here is from the reference manual for enumerators about 1960, and it says the directions are, for a person who was born in a hospital or elsewhere outside the state in which his family was living at the time he was born, report the state in which his family was living at the time of his birth, not the state in which the hospital was located. So genealogists might find that on this census, somebody's reporting a state that they were born in, which is not the state that they normally thought the person was born in because of this rule. And I wondered about this, and I found out that on a procedural history of the census was the following. This is probably why they did it. It said the statistics on state of birth are of value mainly for the information they provide on the historic movements of the native population from one state to another within the United States from the time of birth to the date of the census. The census figures on state of birth only show the migration of persons who have moved from one state to another and who are, on the date of census, living in states other than those in which they were born. The statistics, therefore, afford no indication of the amount of migration within a given state, from rural to urban, for instance, or from one locality to another within the state, nor do they show intermediate moves between the time of a person's birth and the time of the census. So maybe that's why they did that. So I found out, for instance, that for California in 1960, about 17% of their U.S. native population had been born in other states, the highest value of the U.S. states in 1960. People were moving to California in high numbers. However, the fastest growing states in 1960 were Florida, Nevada, Alaska, and Arizona. So let's look at a continuation here, and we'll look at a number of things that were not in the 1950 census, and you can see that as well. Year moved into this house, that's an interesting question. Attending public or private school, that's a new one, in 1960. And of course, you can stop this presentation to take a look at these tables in more detail. And some other things as well here. Not in 1950 census, year when last worked, name of employer, place of work, and means of transportation to work. That's kind of a neat little question that you'll get some material on. So continuing my interesting facts, I found out according to the Enumerator Reference Manual that they define the census day not as April 1st, 1960, but as 12:01 a.m. on April 1st, 1960. So if you do this specifically to the letter of the law, if you were born after that, even 1 minute later, you should not be on the census. If a person died exactly at 12 o'clock, 12 midnight 02 a.m. on April 1st, 1960, their name also should not appear in that census according to the instructions. Of course, sometimes the enumerators didn't follow instructions. Here's another fact that I found interesting, actually on a publication in 1969, which was the median age of the U.S. population on the different censuses. And the median number is where half of the sample you're looking at is above this number and half is below the number. It's not the average. And so you can see the 1820 census, the median age was teenagers. And you go up until 1960, where it's 29.6 years. This may indicate both an increase in life expectancy and potentially a decrease in birth rate as well. A number of new sample items on facilities and equipment on the housing schedule were added, including use of air conditioners, washing machines, and freezers. And I think you'll see all those questions with the population forms, providing your family was sampled. And then I'm always interested in questions that were rejected. Lots of questions are given to the Census Bureau mainly by lobbying groups, and most of them are declined. Questions like, do you own a Bible? What color is your hair? Do you own a dog? That sort of thing. But they seriously debated and then rejected a question on what is your religion? And there's a whole article on this. Would make an interesting talk for those of you who will be eventually talking about the 1960 census. So let's look at the short form. This is the form that was given to everybody to fill out. It was also what's called stage 1. The enumeration was done in 2 stages, stage 1 and stage 2. And so the Census Bureau was unhappy with past high rates of enumerator error, and it was often consistent throughout an individual enumerator's work area and characterized by all but the simplest questions. They did a terrible job. So the Census Bureau tried to this experiment in 1950 actually, to have the population self-enumerate themselves by filling out the forms themselves. And this led up to what you're seeing in this census, the 1960 census. So the short form is the 100% or non-sample data. It's the first population and housing census that the U.S. Postal Service delivered to each household in late March, and it's called the Advanced Census Report, ACR. And I'm going to be using that abbreviation throughout this talk, ACR. And people were asked to complete the ACR form, but not mail it back, and hold it for an enumerator to pick up. And about 60% of the households and groups that received these had them filled out before the April enumerator visit. The ACRs differed in terms of whether they were for large cities or for other areas, and so there's a variation in this form. And the short form only asks 5 questions. Only 5 questions on the Advanced Census Report, or ACR. Relationship to head of family, sex, race, marital status, the quarter of the year that your birth fell in, such as January, February, March, that's a quarter, April, May, and June, and year of birth. And And I should mention that this was the first attempt to even get close to the month of birth. The last time this was done was in the 1900 census, where they asked for the month and year of birth. It includes names of the people in the household or group quarters and their addresses, and it includes 11 to 16 housing questions, depending upon whether they're in large cities or not. And I saw in one of my references that citizenship questions were asked only for New York State and Puerto Rico. It'd be interesting to see if that actually did happen. So the enumerator comes, knocks on the door, could I see your ACR? Well, maybe it wasn't filled out. Maybe it was filled out incorrectly. And so the enumerator's job was to make sure it was done correctly, and then to transfer the information to FOSDIC sheets. So if it was not done or incomplete or inaccurate, the enumerator did this directly and penciled the answers on the sheet. The ACRs were not preserved. So this is kind of interesting. What was preserved? Well, we will find out in this talk. So there's a certain level of intimacy with the census forms from the past that will be missing here, as we won't see the originals of what our respondents actually filled out. So let's ask, what is FOSDIC? Well, the first time I saw that word, I thought, oh, I know what that is. This is FOSDIC. It's an Al Cap cartoon. He also wrote Little Abner. And you might remember that Fearless Fosdek, kind of a takeoff of Dick Tracy. But that's not it. That can't be it because that has a K at the end of Fosdek. So what is FOSDIC? This is FOSDIC. Film optical sensing device for input to computers. And what this device is going to do is it's going to read these forms, which were put on microfilm, and transfer them to magnetic tape. And the magnetic tape was then used to analyze the census. And I'll show you the steps involved in this in a second. So we're dealing with a computerized system here of data analysis. Let's look at the long form in stage 2. So when the enumerator comes to your house and picks up the ACR, then 1 out of 4 housing units and group areas are given the long form to fill out. 1 out of 4, 25%. And here's a stage 2 enumerator manual that says to the enumerators they're training that stage 2 is perhaps the more exacting part of the census, as this sample of 1/4 of all the housing units and population represents all housing units and persons. In other words, the sample is going to be used for the statistics, many of the statistics for the communities, counties, and the nation, and they will be based on that sample information. So enumerators, it's essential that your stage 2 enumeration be accurate and complete. So these households were given this additional material to fill out, and they had to mail it back to the local district office. So to emphasize this again, the enumerator prepared and left sample questionnaires at 1 out of 4 households. These are not the advanced forms, or groups to be answered and mailed, postage paid within 3 days back to their district office. And the initial mail response rate for the sample questions was 77%. That's pretty darn good. As I talked to you today, I looked it up and that compared that to the 2020 census, where as of July 14th, 2020, that's 3.5 months after people should have filled out their form, the national response rate was 62.1%. So we're certainly not doing as well as we did in 1960. Okay. Enumerators in late April revisited, phoned, or sent letters to households that had not mailed back the forms or their forms needed to be corrected. That was stage 2. So why a sample? Well, that's a good question. You're able to add more questions. Speed of field work increased. Fast analysis of the sample versus regular questions. Permitted publication of data that otherwise would not be possible. And it started in 1940. I call it the beginning of the end then. That the number of questions asked of everyone started to decrease, and the number of questions asked of a sample tended to increase. And today, 2020, not only do we have a very short non-sample census, but we also have from the Census Bureau something called the American Community Survey, which is a multi-page document which is equivalent to this long form that we're going to look at. So where do we stand on the 1960 census on this line? Well, it turns out we're way up there. That's a real surprise how fast the Census Bureau went to sampling. And we find out that this was the first time, the 1960 long form, the sampling form, that the sample questions had more items than non-sample questions. So there's an additional 31 questions on population, and 30 plus housing questions were asked, the plus because it depended on whether you were in large cities or not. Now, important to realize that the sampling unit in 1960 was a housing unit or a group quarters, not an individual like previous census years. So if your family was picked as to get the long form, you will get information about everybody in that family. Quite different than 1950. So more information about the sampling, because it did vary throughout the United States. In about 1/5 of U.S. sparsely settled areas, these are rural areas, the sample answers were recorded at the same time as the advance form was picked up. They did both of them at once. The sample housing questions had some questions appear in 80% of those questionnaires, and some of them only on 20%, and some questions on all of the housing questionnaires. So, certain amount of variation in the forms and the summaries that you will see. And then what happened was that the long form answers and the original population and housing answers from the advance census report for that unit were transferred to a separate FOSDIC book devoted to the sample forms. So to make it clear, for each enumeration district, because each an ED has a FOSDIC book, for each ED, therefore, there should be 2 books. A book devoted to the short form and a book devoted to the long form. And considering there were about 300,000 1960 enumeration districts, that's 600,000 of these books. But to emphasize this again, that the permanent record of the 1960 census of population and housing is the information contained on the FOSDIC schedules. The original short form and long forms that the respondents filled out were destroyed. They were not filmed. Now, I'm going to show you how these FOSDIC schedule forms were actually filled out here. But there are 2 areas I want to talk about first. Tend to be, especially the tapes, tend to be a little controversial. So first, let's look at coding. And this is my overview of what I think happened in the 1960 census. So let's review the process. So a household gets an advance census report in ACR. They fill it out. They wait for the enumerator. The enumerator comes and transfers the answers to the ACR FOSDIC form book. And we'll look at that book. That book is microfilmed. The pages are microfilmed. And FOSDIC, the machine, reads the microfilm and produces a magnetic tape that has all the information on it. And that tape is analyzed by a high-speed computer. What about the long form? The long form answers are put on their own FOSDIC form, but before that happened, the answers on the ACR from those households that were being sampled were also transferred to that FOSDIC form. So the long form FOSDIC form should contain the ACR answers and the long form answers as well. After that was done, codes were added to some of those items. And then that book was microfilmed, and that book was transferred into magnetic tape, and then it was analyzed by computer. So there was a lot of coding going on the sampling. Now, in past censuses, my talks, I would give you this warning that the coding columns will put on the schedule after the enumeration and provide no additional information. People see these numbers, they think there's additional information there. Well, it turns out in 1960, this warning is not quite correct. And here I find from the procedure, and this is about institutions and their coding numbers, this says that during the clerical coding operation after the enumeration, so that's still true, the list of special institutional enumeration districts and the card file of information on smaller institutions were used by the coders in conjunction with information contained in the listing book concerning name, type, and address of the group quarters as reported by the enumerator. We're not going to see the enumerator's listing book. It was used in both stage 1 and stage 2. And it goes on to say here that, and I'll skip around a little bit, it says here for institution, go to the bottom, for institutions for which no card was found which had a coding number, and for other types of group quarters, the coder was instructed to code the institution from the name and type of group quarters entered in the listing book by the enumerator. So you have a person you're looking up that's in one of these institutions or group quarters. And here are some examples of the numbers that were assigned. These are codes. You can see them here. And some more. And we then have a category here of persons in group quarters other than institutions, such as student dormitories or military installations or missions, etc. And suddenly you may see a coding number that what's on the rest of the long form FOSDIC form you're looking at doesn't give you why that number's there. It's very possible it's because of the listing book that I'll show you a page from in a second. A little complicated. There's another myth that circulated about the 1960 census, that because the information was put on magnetic tape, and because the computers that read it are now obsolete and can't read it again, that we've lost the 1960 information. And that is not correct. There's a National Archives record on this, and there's also a 2011 paper that indicates that it is correct that some of the tape were lost. But the complete set of microfilmed enumeration manuscript forms survives. The long-form data covering 25% of the population is stored on approximately 30,000 100-foot reels of 16mm film, and those copies of the film are scheduled for public release in April 2032. And I wrote to Ruggles, who I had previously corresponded with, and asked him what about the short forms. And one of the co-authors wrote back to me, Trent Alexander, and indicated that those have also been preserved. And he said, I can confirm that the Census Bureau has the FOSDIC sheet transcriptions of the 1960 short forms as well, stored on about 12,000 microfilm reels. So whatever you heard about the 1960 census, that, they were destroyed, we're not going to be able to see it, blah, blah, blah. According to these references, no, that is not correct. And this quote I thought was interesting, that more than 950 miles of microfilm were needed to record the information collected from the 1960 population and housing schedules, and the printed reports exceeded 100,000 pages. So let's actually look at how the enumerator eventually went from forms that respondents filled out to what is on the FOSDEC schedules. And we'll look at the short forms first, and we're going to do this from my kit. You will find that the short and long forms come in some variations. So you have here, you're looking at a stage 1 training workbook. Everything has a document number. I'm going to show you another workbook in a second that looks exactly like this one, but it has a different number and it's different on the upper right. And this is stage 1. Remember, this is the short form, PH1. And PH1 is a process for outside large cities. PH2 is going to be inside or for some large cities. Okay. The workbook shows, and I have some originals of this, but I'll show you it in the workbook, what an advanced census report form looked like. And this is for smaller cities and rural areas. And there are only a few questions that are asked here. This is form PH5. And the census taker comes and takes this form, can put down the enumeration district number on it. I don't think that's there before it was sent out by mail. Remember, this was sent out by mail. And it says, hold this report for the census taker, do not mail. And then in the inside of this, there are just a few questions. You can see the names of the people that are in this household and some basic questions about them. And there are some basic questions on the previous page about the housing that they're in. So this is another training workbook. It has a different number. This is PH2, and this is for larger cities. So they're going to ask more information here. And I'll show you that they're asking more information. This is form PH6. This is the one I just showed you, PH5. Now, if we look at the difference between these two, and the first thing I'll say is I think they made a mistake here, that they put the same sample person's name, the example, identical, the same address for both these forms. Well, PH6 shouldn't be Lee, Maryland, even if it exists. It should be Baltimore. It should be a large city. They shouldn't have the same phone number. But of course, if you're an enumerator, you're only going to get one of these. You're either going to be responsible for PH5 advanced forms or PH6. You're not going to see both of these. It turns out that this kit, I think, is a supervisor. The kit I have is from a supervisor, and so there are multiple forms here, which is great because then I can get an overview of the process. So if we do look at the PH6 form, we find out there's more information, more questions asked about how much is your property worth and how much rent do you pay a week or month or whatever. There's more information there. And then the same information is asked about the family. There are other forms that were given to households, like this is an individual census report. That's part of the kit. These are people who are visitors that are there. They may not be put on the actual form for the household, but need to be tracked down. And then what the census taker did when they came to this person's house, they had this enumeration book, this FOSDIC book of forms, that they were going to transfer the information from the ACR to this book. I'm holding it here to give you an idea. The book has on the front cover what is the enumeration district number, which is not going to be on any of the pages in this book, because the pages in this book were not to be torn out. They all were in a specific sequence. You can see some of the information here. It was also used to process payroll and stuff like this. So again, this was unusual to see in this kit, but I think that the reason is because it was a supervisor that owned this kit. And then we have the form itself here, and the form has some stuff had to be put in by handwriting, but you see that there are these circles. And what the enumerator had to do was using a pencil, a regulation pencil, to fill in the circle. And there's a whole bunch of instructions about how to fill in circles. Don't go outside of the circle. Don't put marks anywhere on the rest of the page, etc. Because what's going to happen is these are going to be microfilmed, and then FOSDEC is going to put the information on magnetic tape. So it has to know exactly where it is on the page. And this little card that I have says to the enumerator that your marks must be as dark or darker than the borders of this card. Kind of cute. Now, this is one of the forms that you may see. This is PH1. You can see the PH1 on the top. You notice there's a blank section on the right, and there's a blank section on the upper right. This is, remember that this is an area that doesn't include large cities, smaller cities, and rural areas. If we look at that other workbook, it shows you what this form looks like, PH2. And in the upper right now, because this is for cities, large cities, it shows you a block number. So you can actually go to a block. And then on the bottom, it shows you the amount of money that is rental, and also how much the property is worth. Now, there may be maybe 3 or 4 families that are on these short form FOSDEC. It's going to be very different in the long form. So let's look at the long forms. And I don't have an original long form I was given to households. I do have a number of other things. I found this online where this delinquent person, Matilda Spuyek in Chicago, didn't return her long form. So she got this little message from the Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam tells her, that according to our records, we have not received the form your census taker left for you to fill in. The information for your household is needed to help complete this nationwide 1960 census. A reply is required by law. Sounds, serious here. The census taker has not been able to find any member of your household at home after several visits. Please fill in the enclosed form and mail it within 3 days. An address envelope is enclosed for your convenience. And it shows you a sample of the long form. So this is the long form. There's a lot more information here that's required. There's also an individual questionnaire, like we saw some forms for the household on the short form. I have an original of that. And then it's put on its own FOSDEC sheet in its own FOSDEC book for this enumeration district. The top has the housing unit information with additional questions. And some of these were some of these are transferred over from the original ACR. On the bottom is individual information, the population information. And we're looking at a single housing unit, a single family. On the next page, we have space for 2 more individual information people. So every 2 pages, there's 1 housing and 3 individual information. If you have 6 people in your family, it's going to occupy 4 of these pages, and they won't repeat all the housing information. There's a way of telling the computer that this is a continuation family. So every single person who fits in that sample, who is picked in that sample, is going to have information about them. Okay, let's see if you qualify to be a 1950 census taker. As you know, and you should know from my past YouTubes, that's one of my major interests. Stage 1. You want to be an enumerator? You're a U.S. citizen? Are you 18 years or older with a high school education or equivalent? Do you understand written and spoken instruction? Can you do simple arithmetic? Can you walk a lot, climb stairs, work on your feet? Can you pass a written test? If you're in a rural area, do you have a car? Can you drive? I don't see actual requirements in 1960. These are based on 1950 and 1970 information I have. Well, congratulations. You've been picked. Here's a notice to report for training. And somewhat ambiguous here, but here they're indicating that you're going to be trained for 3 days at 4 hours each day. I've seen another area where it says you're only going to be trained for 3 hours each day. Remember, it starts April 1st, so it's going to be tight. March 28th, March 29th, March 30th. Peak employment for enumerators came about 160,000 on April 7th, 1960. I'll show you why that drops out later. There were 10,000 plus crew leaders, and there was 1 crew chief for 15 enumerators. So there was quite a bit more quality control here. And there's your stage 1 enumerators, 3 days of training. And I'll show you what happened on those days. And so this is from the training workbook. First day, why we take a census, your job, the housing unit, where to count people, practice interviews. Then they were given homework. Second day, they reviewed the exercises, housing question, the FOSDIC marking, how to mark them, and care of schedules. Don't make a mess of that book. Practice interviews. And then the third day, this is stage 1. Again, review of home exercises, canvassing, callbacks, leaving questionnaires, how your work will be reviewed, transcription from stage 1 to stage 2 FOSDIC book, that's important, etc. You had your own manual, and I'm going to tell you how to get this in a second. Stage 1. And here is a checklist of forms that you were given. Some of these I think are kind of neat. We've covered some of these. You can come back and look at that, but the ones I'm interested in, there was a hotel census report form. That was both stage 1 and sample population. There was a notice of census taker. Is left by enumerator when no one is at home the first time he calls. And then there's another form, PH12, is left by enumerator when no one is at home the third time he calls, the last time. And it states the number of persons recorded for the household. So the enumerator would say, you haven't been home. I found out from your neighbors and other sources that there are blah, blah, blah person living in this place. And that's what I'm going to record for you. If you think it's wrong, you better let me know. And this is one way of reducing the undercount. And also this one here about the listing book, which we're not going to see. Used for recording address, sample key, this is how to do with the sampling, name of household, head, and number of persons enumerated for every household unit. There's a place for remarks. Also used as a callback record and completion record. And that listing book is going to be given to the enumerator for stage 2. And this is a from the training manual, a listing book page. You see there's a stage 1 and a stage 2. Stage 2 will be later. List the people and information about them. If group quarters, enter name and type. There is a remark column there as well. Some more things that stage 1 people got. The appendixes are extensive in the manual. You can read the titles here. Enumeration and military installations. A T-night enumeration. They went out on, see if I can blow that up. They went out on the night of March 31st and the morning of April 1st to apartment hotels, motels, YMCAs to record people who were transients. And there's a whole section on that. Very interesting. A lot of the things that insight into the census can be gotten on this publication called Procedural History. I will give you a link to that or show you how to get that later. Here is an example of a home exercise. For instance, an ACR contains a note that a son is home on vacation from college. College people, students, were to be enumerated at their college, not at their house, the last week in March. Although he usually lives as his college in another city, you find that he does not think there's anyone to report him for him at his college residence. So what are you going to do? You're going to fill out a individual census report for the son and omit him from the FOSDEC schedule. So somehow that ICR is going to end up somewhere in this college town. Do you include the son with the household you were listing? No. Do not do anything about the son since he will be enumerated elsewhere? Probably no. So the answer, I would think, is number 1. And here are some diagrams from the training manual. This is in both the urban and the rural training manuals. It shows blocks and how to treat blocks and the boundaries of blocks. And this particular one is for non-block areas, as you can see up there, and for people who were enumerating large cities, they wouldn't even see this page in their manual. That page is blank. It even shows how to organize your materials in that carrying case that they have, and that I opened up my carrying case. Certainly don't have as many forms in there to show you what it looks like. It shows you what your obligations are. Can't discuss the information with anyone except your supervisors. Never permit an unauthorized person to have access to the schedules. Penalty or fine or imprisonment if you make problems for the Census Bureau. And then finally, number 4, to refrain, this is the Hatch Act, to refrain from engaging in any activities or discussions not directly related to the work of enumeration. For example, selling, soliciting, or distributing literature for or discussing any special cause, including politics. There was a field review, and this could be important. The enumerator could be fired for poor quality of work. This is from the Glick's paper. It says during both the first and second stages, the enumerators will be subject to detailed review of their work by field reviewers or crew leaders. This step is undoubtedly one of the most valuable innovations that have been introduced in the 1960 census in the field procedures. It provides a method for clarifying questions which arise in the first few days of enumeration and for detecting at an early stage which enumerators are in need of further training or are totally incompetent. Especially important is the final review of the enumerator's work. They're not going to get paid if they don't pass these. And another one that during this stage 1 enumeration also happens in stage 2. There will be a formal quality control program with uniform procedures and acceptance standards. Mistakes brought to light by this program will be the basis for remedial action. And this is, and I have scanned this one, I'll show you that later. This is a practice exercise for training field reviewers. And there's even an answer sheet for that practice. And this material is to be used as a key for the practice exercise, which will be used in training crew leaders for stage 1 field review. So because this is in my kit that I got, and other things, I think I'm dealing with a kit from a high-level administrator of the 1960 census. And here is a field review. This is a sample showing how detailed the list is and what had to be corrected. And then the work of the stage 1 enumerator will end with the transcription of the non-sample data from the stage 1 FOSDIC book schedules to the stage 2 FOSDIC book schedules for that ED number, which will finally contain all the data collected, non-sample as well as sample for the 25% sample of households. Very clear. Stage 2. Well, stage 2, about one-third of the stage 1 enumerators were given stage 2 assignments. Two-thirds of them were dismissed. Only stage 1 enumerators who demonstrated their ability to follow instructions faithfully and to complete their assignments quickly and satisfactorily were considered for a stage 2 assignment. And they had 8 hours of additional training. And they're going to be dealing with the long form. They have their own manual. They have this material. They got the sample FOSDEC schedule book from stage 1 enumerator. They would have 3 of these then. If they had 3, they could have up as much as 3 EDs. They had the listing book. They have the stage 2 manual. They got the ED maps. And those ED maps were marked up by the stage 1 people to show perhaps where a house was that was hard to locate, maybe where they did calls, etc., etc. And have detailed instructions for what each of the questions on the long form are, how they should have been answered, and also detailed instructions for the housing items. And you can come back and take a look at these by freezing the screen. They were told what's an adequate and inadequate answer. So when someone said, what is your business or industry, if the person put down bakery, that wasn't enough. Are you a wholesale bakery? Are you a retail bakery? If you're in dairy, dairy farm, dairy depot, dairy bar, dairy products, etc. So they're trained to do this. And they have two appendices. One of them tells them that on the night of April 20th, they're going to go out and they're going to visit missions, flop houses, similar places, jails, detention centers, and they're going to enumerate them. And by the time the census takers, I thought this was a cute statistics, by the time the census takers had finished their task at the end of April, they had traveled a total of more than 50 million miles. This distance equals about 2,000 trips around the Earth. Incredible. So, how did they do? In terms of people who were missed, the undercount, 1960, missed about 3%. About 1 out of 33 people were missed. That's pretty good considering previous years. Now, I know this is a long one, but this is the only one I'm going to be doing in 1960 for a long period of time. And I'll tell you that the Census Bureau has online instructions that enumerators got. However, they're missing 1960 and 1970. I have those, right? Instead, what they do, the Census Bureau, is they tell you in detail what respondents were given, what questions they were asked, what directions they were given. There is another source of instructions to enumerators at the University of Minnesota's IPUMS website. However, as you can see here, that they stop at 1950. But just like the Census Bureau, what they do is they show the instructions to the respondents going through the various forms. Well, I have the manuals. The manuals are actually online, and I'm going to give you this. You can get to them providing the following. This is a Hatha Trust, probably mispronouncing that, is a partnership of academic and research institutions offering a collection of millions of titles digitized from libraries around the world. And in order to see this and you can see this, but in order to actually download it, you have to be a member of one of the institutions that form a partnership. And my home institution, California State University, Fullerton, of which I'm an emeritus professor, is not a member. So I decided that I would scan all the manuals and offer them free to you. It's on my Dropbox account. Get them while you can. I can't, I don't know what happens to Dropbox accounts over time. I also scanned the training workbooks that I showed you, the field review as well. Here are references used in this talk. For those of you who are going to be talking about this in 10 years, there are probably going to be more references, but I would highly recommend the Glick one. It is very, very good. And highly recommend the procedural history one that is online at IPUMS. And that ends the talk. I hope you got a lot out of it. And I'm not sure when you'll be listening to this talk. Maybe in 10 years, it will mean a lot more than it does in 2020. So, This has been a PowerPoint talk on JDW Talks. Counting this one, I now have 7 U.S. and New York City Census talks for genealogists and other researchers, including information on the 1950 census, which will become public in April of 2022. And I will tell you that I have enumerator kits for 1970, 1980, 1990, and 2000, and I may put up those as well as videos. I have 5 Ellis Island talks, including how to find difficult people and the name change myth. And as you may know, if you looked up my background, I'm a field biologist. I have 2 virtual birding field trips. Probably will have 3 by the fall. 2 Life of the Naturalist Adolphus L. Heerman, which a number of species are named in his honor, and 4 birding optic talks. And so I'm going to post 2 of my census talks here. Wait about 10 seconds or so, and then stop. So hope you enjoyed that. Bye bye.